I just want to introduce my very good friend. So one of the great joys of being back is to see wonderful composers that we haven't seen for a while. So Eugene O'Brien is a long-standing friend and someone that many of you will remember from a big song cycle of his called Algebra of Night that we performed about 4 years ago?
During an ice storm, I don't know if this is on, was performed during an ice storm in February 2015.
Can you?
Yeah.
That's
so
right.
I think thanks to the storm, there were probably about 50 people in the audience.
Well, including these, I'm sure, intrepid souls. And then we subsequently recorded that piece. And it's been sitting there waiting for a companion, sitting there in a lonely state of being in a can, waiting for a companion, which Gene and I sort of planned, and Gene committed to writing a piece that would fit well on a CD with this very long song cycle. And we'll be talking about that in a little while. And he proceeded to write that piece, and then it sat, because of the pandemic, for quite a while. So we are thrilled to be finally bringing that piece to life and recording it actually tomorrow. But we'll have a chance to talk about that later. First, I kind of wanted to talk in more general terms about the program, and I've asked Gene if we could just kind of do a flip-flop. So I'm going to be grilling him about his piece, and I'm asking him to be the MC for the other part. So you can grill me, and I'll pretend that I'm Eric Santos, James Willey, Arthur Cunningham, Jim Primosh, and Steve Albert. That will be a feat. So let me turn it over to you, Gene.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming too. This is, as I'm sure it is for many of you, this is my first live concert since February 2020.
Is that true for others? I mean, some have been to concerts, but anybody else not been to a live concert? A few. So you and I are among those.
Yeah.
I haven't either.
Yeah. And this event this evening feels like a renewal. We still have a long way to go, obviously, with the pandemic, but this is a beginning. And one of the things that I'm reminded of on this occasion of actually having a music performed and an audience here is the French term to describe how an audience comes to a concert, where the French say to assister, to assist at the concert. So that the audience is not simply a passive group of listeners, they're actually part of the musical experience along with the performers. So I think it's very important to recognize that, especially in these very unique circumstances that we find ourselves.
That's beautiful.
The concert has been titled Elegy, and I think it's not too surprising or difficult to figure out what the term means in the current circumstances. But I would be interested in hearing from Christopher how the various pieces on the concert were chosen, because there's a rather interesting mix of different types of music and different expressions of elegy on the concert.
Yeah. Good question, Gene. Thanks for asking that. Well, as usual, our programs go through a long sort of period of percolating in my brain, like popcorn. No wonder it's called popcorn music, the contemporary music. It percolates in my brain. And the inception of the program idea is in fact Gene's piece. So we've been excited about and committed to premiering it now for quite a while. And it's, as you'll read and as we'll talk about, called Elegy to the Spanish Republic, and we'll talk about why. But certainly the elegiac quality of that piece was easy to extrapolate under the circumstances into a sort of a musical elegy for all those people and really all those experiences like concerts and things that we've lost during this recent period. So it's sort of an elegy for our times that I thought about in assembling the program. Having said that, I wasn't really interested in having a program that was uniformly, somber. So there's really quite an affective variety, I think, among these pieces, even if there's an overall sort of overarching elegiac kind of sense about the program. But Gene's piece sits in the exact middle of the program, and there's roughly a half an hour of music before it, and there's an intermission, brief intermission in there, and then there's something like that afterwards. So Elegy to the Spanish Republic is definitely was the inception of the program idea, and really sits in the middle of the program.
It's certainly clear that some of the pieces on the program do fit our conception of what an elegy is, the Stephen Albert piece in many ways, and the others too. The Eric Santos is an extremely eclectic composer with many, many different kinds of musical influences. I don't know this particular piece, but I'd be interested in your idea of how that fits into the mix of music.
Yeah.
His program note is very evocative. He says exactly what he means.
Yeah, and you can read that and probably gather enough from it. Eric Santos, actually, as you say, is a real musical polymath. He's a rocker, a rock guitarist, and has a group called October Babies that he's active performing with, and it's quite a thing. And he's also the chair of the composition department currently at the University of Michigan. So he was on my faculty when I was dean there. He's also a wonderful tenor. I don't think he lists that in his credits, but he's a serious, excellent singer on top of everything else. He doesn't write that much music in the classical domain, but what he does write, I think, is really arresting and wonderful. This piece is obviously appropriate to the time. He wrote me a little email this morning, couldn't be here, but thanking us for programming the piece, and I meant to bring it. But it's a beautiful couple of sentences saying, something to the effect that consolation is something we really need now. And this piece, although it was written earlier, certainly speaks to that. Well, you'll see it's a very slow, very contemplative kind of piece. But my hope is that it will establish a feeling of reflection at the beginning of the program and sort of put us in the right place for the rest of the program.
There's a composer on the program, Arthur Cunningham, who I think is probably not familiar to most of us, but someone I think who deserves more recognition and certainly more exposure than he had in his lifetime.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, I mean, I have another of my faculty colleagues at Michigan to thank. John Ellis on the piano faculty was a student of Arthur Cunningham's and took it upon himself to collect and organize his work. And it was among that collection that I found this piece, which felt particularly appropriate to this program. Arthur Cunningham was a black jazz pianist and very distinguished composer with training at Juilliard, and he definitely knew his stuff. For some reason, he hasn't been, he isn't well known. I didn't know of him until I learned of him through John Ellis, my colleague at Michigan. But I was delighted to find his work, and there's an extensive catalog that I hope we'll be able to revisit. This piece is I think it's in the notes, or it may not be. I actually did research about Cunningham and found very little. But I did find an interview with a composer on WQXR radio in New York from, I think, the late 60s, and learned most of what I know about him from that, including the fact that he was a real Shakespearean and wanted to do a setting of the entire Midsummer Night's Dream, which would have been an ambitious undertaking. As it turns out, he did 5 sort of scenes from Midsummer Night's Dream, of which this is one. So it was originally a song with text, Pyramus and Thisbe's scene, this scene that treats those 2 characters. Thisbe, interestingly, he misspells on purpose, I'm sure, with an Y at the end. And it, you know, I didn't research, but you know, those characters go way back to Ovid, I think, and you know, it may be spelled sometimes with a Y. This by dying, you know, and he, in the, you all know probably the scene from Midsummer Night's Dream. So in any case, it was written in that form, and then he embellished the voice part and transferred it to a flute, and that's the form we'll hear it tonight, you know, for flute and cello.
The piece by James Willey, in multiple movements, you've divided up so that the movements are interrupted by other pieces in between. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, it's 3 pieces in memory of Stephen Albert. So we're ending the program, as we'll get to in a minute, with Stephen Albert's piece. And I think about 10 years after Stephen Albert was tragically killed at the age of 51 in an auto accident, James Willey, who had been a good friend of Stephen's, had occasion to write this piece in memory of Stephen, or 3 pieces. It's 3 really distinct but related pieces, and it's marvelous. We did it at the time when he wrote it, and then it's kind of been sitting there ever since. I'm not sure it has received other performances, but it occurred to me as a wonderful form of elegy, you know, musical elegy for Albert, and I thought it'd be great to hear the piece again, and I'm so glad we are. It's really a marvelously quirky, mercurial kind of writing that was characteristic of Jim Willey. And since they're 3 distinct movements, it seemed like a wonderful opportunity to interpolate, you know, brief other pieces. So in a way, the Santos sort of serves as a little, you know, a little prologue to this chunk of music in the first half, with these couple of other short pieces in between the movements. I just want to, if you give me another second on this question, there are a whole bunch of, there's sort of skein of interlocking, interesting things, at least in my personal experience, with these 2 composers that are linked on this program, Willey and Albert. Stephen Albert was a resident composer at the Seattle Symphony in the 80s, late 80s. And actually it was through his association with a music director there, Gerard Schwartz, that Jerry found out about me and asked me to come out and do a reading of contemporary music for the orchestra that was part of a big Meet the Composer grant. Yeah. You remember that? Yeah. And so I went to Seattle to conduct the Seattle Symphony in this. One result of that was that Jerry asked me to be associate conductor. So I spent the next 5 years in that role. But another effect was that one of the pieces that was chosen for the reading was this wonderful piece by a composer I'd never heard of named James Willey, a piece called Hymnal. And it was marvelous. I ended up programming it with my first subscription concert with Seattle Symphony. And that's the way they got to know each other, and it sort of went from there. So I have personal things. By the way, Stephen Jaffe also had a piece on that first reading session. And he's remained a good friend and a composer whose works you've heard the Consort perform a number of times. So anyway, we're really happy to be doing this piece. I think he captured many of Stephen Albert's sort of wild and crazy character traits in this piece, which takes all kinds of turns. And the middle movement, called Bonkers, I think was Jim's real, tip of the hat to Stephen.
In pointing this out, we've revealed something I think that's true of the world of composers in this country. It's actually quite small. And though we all may go in different compositional directions and may not always agree with each other, most of us know each other in one respect or another. One of the composers on the program I did know, although this was many years ago, is James Primash, who, when I was teaching in Cleveland, at the Cleveland Institute, James was a student at Cleveland State University, and I heard many of his student pieces at that time, and then other pieces, obviously, after that. So I have a kind of way back, this goes back to the 1970s, association with him. And I think his absence among us now is really a great loss.
Indeed it is, and that's interesting to hear because he was also a very, very accomplished pianist. And our first exposure to him was performing George Crumb's Celestial Mechanics with Lambert Orchis. And then I found out about his composing. And he went through quite an evolution as a composer of pretty hard-edged Davidovsky influenced music, which is wonderful, and we've done a fair amount of it. But all the while, as a very devout person, he was writing sacred music at the same time, in a beautiful sort of pantonal musical language, quite different from his Davidovsky stuff. And later in his life, he began merging those two in pieces, first sort of by alternating movements between styles, and then by somehow sort of merging them. And his, mature works were amazing amalgams of these languages that he had developed in his own work. The song that we are including on this program is from fairly late in his work, and has this incredible, sort of ineffable, beautiful lyricism. And it's a text, you can read about it, it's a text that he had grown to love and kept for a long time, and then wrote for a certain occasion. And I just, I felt that as a elegy for Jim, who died after a really difficult struggle with cancer this last spring, tremendous loss to the musical world and a personal one to me and the Consort. I think this piece, I'm just so glad that we could do it, and we have this wonderful soprano here to sing it. So it's a small, brief tribute to Jim. We'll of course be doing other works of his into the future. So that's the first half.
Well, the piece that concludes the concert, Stephen Albert's piece, is a major work, I think.
Yeah.
And he manages to find things in Finnegan's Wake texturally that he expresses musically that I think are really very affecting, but also wild.
Yeah.
It's he embodies things that Joyce put into that text that I think just reading it on its own, you might not imagine.
Yeah. And who knows whether Joyce would have imagined it either.
Exactly, right.
We'll never know, nor something, nor miss you. It's a phenomenal piece. I just think it's wonderful, and we revisit it every decade or so. First, having encountered it through the good offices of Joe Schwantner, who sent me the score and said, you should look at this piece, in about 1979, just after I think Stephen had finished it. Stephen was an pretty much unknown composer at the time, making a good living selling stamps, rare stamps and valuable stamps, and composing passionately, if on the side, music that wasn't getting any performances. Somehow, his wife Marilyn told him he really should write a piece for a practical ensemble, because he'd been writing these pieces for 2 cellos and 2 flutes and 2 electric guitars and 6 pianos, and nobody was performing them. So he did. He wrote a piece for soprano and what's become known as the Pierrot ensemble, although he stretches it in ways that still make it a pain in the neck to perform. We have to find a harmonium and inside the piano and blah, blah, blah. But he wrote the piece, and that's what Joe Schwantner sent me. And I didn't have time to deal with it. I put it in a drawer, but somehow it kept nagging at me from the drawer. Little did I know that was absolutely characteristic of Stephen. He was an incredible kvetch. He would just after, and you'll hear that very figure in Jim Willey's piece, because he knew Stephen and heard that. He da, 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 just going on and on. Ah! That's the way Stephen was. And his piece was like that. I kept thinking about it. It was actually just such a marvelous and sort of unprecedented work. It's quite romantic. He calls it sentimental songs. But it at that time, it was kind of audacious. People were not allowed to write music like that in the late 70s, So he was a very rebellious, ornery fellow, and including musically, and wrote this really beautiful setting of 6 sentimental songs and an instrumental interlude based on Joyce. And we performed it and recorded it with the great Lucy Shelton in, I think, 1980. And that recording is available on Spotify, and you can get the CD. It's Delos, paired with Rostropovich and the NSO's performance of Symphony River Run, which got commissioned because Rostropovich heard one of our performances of another piece of Stephen's.
And that's certainly one of his best-known pieces, too,
River Run. Yeah. So,
which, of course, is Joyce again.
Right.
Just to interject, it's the very end of the last text in the piece you'll hear this evening is, of course, the end of Finnegan's Wake, away along and the next word is River Run, which is the first word of Finnegan's Wake, but also ties in with the orchestra piece, too, in an odd kind of way.
Yeah, Gene, you told me that, and I really appreciate it. Yeah, because it ends with this ambiguous word, the, yes. which Catherine, the singer, and I were discussing, is it the or the? And then she found the River Run thing in it, so it's evidently the. Right. And so River Run is, he wrote River Run next, or a couple of pieces later. Anyway, it's a fantastic piece. Many of you probably will remember having heard it, but it's different every time we do it, and I always find new things to love and appreciate about it each time we do it. And of course, To Wake the Dead and the whole text about the wake, about Finnegan's Wake, is, I think, perfectly fitting for the idea of elegy, and definitely takes us to a very different part of the idea of an elegy than the piece that precedes it on the program. And here I'm going to take your hat back. And the piece that precedes it on the program is Elegy to the Spanish Republic. And Gene, I thought for years until last night that one of the reasons you decided to write this piece for the Consort was because we had a visit in my office at the University of Michigan, where I had a big reproduction of number 34 of Robert Motherwell's great series of paintings called Elegy to the Spanish Republic. But it isn't true. You weren't even...
Right, I've never seen it.
Right. So we share, in addition to many years together on the dark side as academic administrators, we also share a love of abstract expressionism and specifically Robert Motherwell's work. So, I mean, there's so much to talk about in this incredible piece, but just to start, maybe you want to tell us a little bit about your impulse to use the Motherwell as an inspiration for a piece. And then, well, yeah, let's start with that.
Sure. Well, I think that for most of us, for many people, and this was certainly true for me too for years, the two works of art that we think of in connection with the Spanish Civil War are Picasso's huge painting Guernica and a novel by Ernest Hemingway called For Whom the Bell Tolls. Those are probably the two most prominent works known to Americans. Lesser known, I think, is that huge series of paintings by Robert Motherwell called Elegy to the Spanish Republic. There are more than 200 of them. He started painting them in 1948-49 and continued for the rest of his life. Most of them are enormous. There are two of them in DC, but unfortunately neither one is visible right now. There's one at the Hirshhorn, which is probably about 7 feet by 10 feet in size. And then there's another one, which may be the largest one that he had painted, that was commissioned by the National Gallery and is normally in the East Building. And it's not there now because of all the construction and everything that's going on. They've removed it. But that painting is about 12 to 15 feet in height and more than 30 feet in length. It's absolutely enormous. In, I think it was 2015, there was an exhibition of elegies, various elegies to the Spanish Republic at a gallery in New York, the Dominique Levy Gallery. And I think the catalog for the exhibition is still available. You can order it on Amazon. But that was the first time I had actually seen a great number of them all at once. There are probably maybe between 15 and 20 of these paintings there. And they are, as the program note mentions, they're very brutal. They're, as Frank O'Hara, was a curator at the Museum of Modern Art, described them as some of the most ominous, brutal and ominous paintings of our time. They're not comfortable to look at. They're not comfortable to live with, I think. And one of the paintings that was in the Dominique Levy Gallery was in private ownership, and there was a photograph of how the owner had kept the painting, and it was on the wall of the dining room of their home. And I remember thinking to myself, who in their right mind would have this really dominant, aggressive work of art over their dining table? I wouldn't be able to eat with that painting.
They were probably found in their apartment, starved.
Right.
Well, you may wonder why I had it in my office, and either I didn't understand the painting, or actually what I've usually said is that I had it there just to remind myself that things could be worse.
So it was after
but
seeing...
But I had to say, it maybe as a little bit of a counter to that, since I did have one in my office, they are just they are, I guess brutal is the word, and brutalist sort of in the way of Marcel Breuer's architecture, these just incredibly powerful, and you need to look at the paintings. But they're another case maybe in which an artistic rendering of a feeling or experience sort of renders it, elevates it in a way, because these paintings are also extraordinarily beautiful.
Yes, yeah.
In addition to being brutal.
Right. They all share several things in common. A great many of them are black and white, and there'll be a very light colored or white background. And at the forefront of the painting are these very, very aggressive vertical black slashes and ovoid figures, which no one is really clear what they actually represent, but they're very, very powerful. I brought the score because I wanted to read something that I put in the score, which Motherwell wrote himself. Motherwell was probably one of the more literate painters. Painters are often not extremely literate in talking about what they've done, but Motherwell was. And one of the things that he says, which is in relation to the elegies, but certainly to all of his work, pictures are vehicles of passion of all kinds, not pretty luxuries like sports cars. In our society, the capacity to give and receive passion is limited. For this reason, the act of painting is a deep human necessity, not the production of a handmade commodity. And I hope that my piece expresses some of that too. It's a very passionate piece. It's not very long, it's about 10 minutes long. It is very aggressive and brutal, I think, like the paintings. It's not an easy piece to do, and for some of you, it may not be an easy piece to listen to. But that's partially, I wouldn't say an intention, but I think partially a reflection of my response to the Motherwell paintings, which are not easy to look at.
Well, Gene, I know that you also in this process have studied a lot about the Spanish Civil War. So, I guess the question is, do things about that terrible cataclysm, sort of prelude to the Second World War, find their way into this piece in any direct way, or is it indirect through Motherwell's expression?
It's both, actually, because I think I mentioned in the notes, there are references to pieces written by composers who experienced the war themselves in various ways. They're not exact quotes, but they're references to the music. There are references to a piece by the Mexican composer Silvestre Revueltas that he wrote in homage to Federico Garcia Lorca, the Spanish poet who was murdered right at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War by Franco's troops. So there's some references to that music there. And the music was played during the war in Madrid and Valencia, and Revueltas came from Mexico and conducted the performances. Another reference is to a piece by the composer from Barcelona, Roberto Gerhard, that is Gerhard was a remarkable figure. He had to flee Spain at the end of the war because he'd been involved with the cultural ministry of the Spanish Republic. And when the Republic was destroyed, Gerhard's life was threatened. So he eventually ended up in England and spent the rest of his life in England. But he was a remarkable person. He studied with Schoenberg, and he's responsible for the International Society of Contemporary Music Festival in Barcelona, which took place just a few months before the war broke out, at which Alban Berg's violin concerto was premiered.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It's a credible combination of circumstances. The third composer is an American composer, Conlon Nancarrow, who actually fought in the war as a volunteer for the Republic. He was wounded, came back to the United States, found himself, as many of the Americans who fought as volunteers on the side of the Republic, found himself persona non grata. He lost his passport. He would not have been permitted to do many things. Yeah. And he moved to Mexico City and spent the rest of his life there, largely writing some amazing pieces for player piano, which are absolutely incredible. But my reference in this piece is not to the player piano pieces, but he was a jazz trumpet player too. And there's certain kinds of rhythmic things of his that find their way into this music.
Yeah. Yes, I can vouch for that. This piece is, very challenging piece in its rhythmic dimensions and others. But it is a powerhouse. No stops, punch, no punches. What do you say? Pull.
Don't pull. Punch.
Yeah, it's really a powerful piece and very satisfying to play. I have to say, it's been wonderful to finally realize it after looking at the score for a while, and it just sounds fantastic. And I think if you know Motherwell's work, these paintings, or can look them up or something before the concert starts, it's, I think, quite possible to experience things, including those big black ovaloid figures in musical gestures that punctuate this piece. So it's really a pleasure and real honor to be able to premiere this piece today. And Gene, it's so great to have you here. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here too, and the rehearsals have been marvelous. And a composer could never wish for more than hearing a piece realized the way the Consort realizes it.